Hey guys, we often picture the Middle Ages through images of roaring hearth fires in stone halls and knights wrapped in thick furs. Yet the deeper reality was far less romantic and far more persistent. The cold was not simply a seasonal inconvenience that arrived with frost and left with the thaw. It was an unrelenting companion that lingered in every breath, every garment, and every corner of daily existence, shaping how people built their homes, layered their clothing, and ordered their lives in ways modern central heating makes almost impossible to imagine. For most, warmth was never guaranteed, even indoors, and the quiet struggle against it became the quiet backdrop to everything else. If you're settling in to listen tonight, whether from the comfort of a bedroom in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or somewhere further afield, I'd be curious to know where you're watching from and what other piece of everyday history you might like us to explore next time. And if this kind of calm, thoughtful journey into the past resonates with you, a simple like really does help support more of these long-form reflections. If you enjoy these quiet immersions into lived historical experience and would like them to continue arriving in your evenings, I warmly invite you to subscribe so future episodes can find their way to you. With that said, let us step back into the medieval world and consider what it truly meant to be cold all the time. To understand the texture of that cold, we must first place ourselves within the climate and landscape of northern and central Europe between roughly the 5th and 15th centuries. For much of the earlier Middle Ages, a period historians sometimes call the medieval warm period brought relatively milder temperatures across many regions. Yet even then, the absence of modern insulation meant that chill still penetrated everyday life. Later, from around the 13th century onward, a gradual cooling trend, what we now recognize as the early stages of the Little Ice Age, made the problem sharper still. Winters lengthened, summers cooled, and the dampness that characterized so much of the northern climate turned every unheated space into a reservoir of lingering discomfort. This was not dramatic Arctic cold, but a steady, bone-deep dampness that never quite left the body, especially for those who spent their days outdoors or in poorly sealed dwellings. Consider first the homes in which the vast majority lived. In rural villages across England, France, the Low Countries, and the German lands, most people dwelt in simple structures of wattle and daub, woven wooden frames packed with mud, straw, and dung, topped with thatched roofs. These walls were thick enough to blunt the worst winds, yet they remained porous. Cracks formed as the daub dried and shrank. Drafts slipped through gaps around door frames and shuttered windows that lacked glass in all but the wealthiest households. At night, when the central hearth fire burned low to conserve fuel, the temperature inside could drop close to that of the air outside. The floor, often beaten earth strewn with rushes or straw, held the dampness and released it slowly, so that even in summer the ground felt cool beneath bare or thinly shod feet. Smoke from the open hearth rose toward a hole in the roof, but until chimneys became more common in the later centuries, much of it lingered, coating the thatch and the lungs alike while carrying away only some of the heat. A peasant family might share this single room with their few animals, perhaps a cow or pig stabled at one end during the worst weather. The animals provided a small but precious source of body heat, yet they also brought moisture and odor, and the space remained far from cozy. Beds were often simple straw pallets raised slightly on wooden frames or laid directly on raised earth benches along the walls. Wool blankets and perhaps a shared cloak served as covers, but they absorbed the dampness of the air and never quite dried fully between uses. Many people woke before dawn to the same penetrating chill that had followed them into sleep, their breath visible in the faint glow of embers that had been carefully banked the night before. Fuel itself was a daily preoccupation. Wood was the primary source of heat, yet it was never abundant. In regions where forests had been cleared for farmland, families relied on careful gathering of fallen branches, or on rites to collect dead wood under manorial custom. In peat-rich lowlands, blocks of turf cut from bogs were dried and burned, though they produced a slower, smokier heat and required constant tending. In some areas, cow dung, shaped into cakes and dried on walls, supplemented the supply. Every autumn brought the same calculation: how much fuel could be laid by before the first hard frosts, and how sparingly it must be used so that it would last until spring. A single night's careless blaze could mean shivering weeks later. Fires were therefore kept modest, often no larger than necessary to boil a pot of pottage or warm a few hands at a time. The hearth was the literal and figurative center of the home, yet its warmth extended only a few feet. Beyond that circle, the cold waited patiently. Clothing offered the next layer of defense, and here too the limitations of material and labor were ever present. Linen undergarments, woven from flax grown locally, provided a smooth layer against the skin but held little warmth when damp. Over this came wool tunics and gowns, spun and woven at home or by village specialists. Wool retained heat even when slightly wet, yet it was heavy, itched when new, and absorbed odors from smoke and animals. A peasant man might wear a knee-length tunic belted at the waist, hose or leggings tied with points, and a short cloak pinned at the shoulder. Women layered kirtles and surcoats, often with an apron for work. Children's clothes were handed down, patched, and resized until the fabric gave way. In winter, additional wraps of coarse wool or sheepskin might be added, but these were precious and reserved for the coldest months or for those who worked farthest from shelter. Gloves and mittens were rare luxuries for field laborers. Many simply tucked hands into sleeves or warmed them periodically at the fire. Footwear consisted of leather shoes or clogs stuffed with straw or moss, yet soles wore thin quickly, and the constant damp of muddy paths or dew-soaked fields meant feet were seldom truly dry. Even the rhythms of labor reflected the cold's quiet authority. Agricultural work continued through much of the year, from plowing in the raw early spring to harvesting in the shortening autumn days. Bodies generated their own heat through motion, yet prolonged exposure left fingers numb and joints stiff. Shepherds on open hillsides, charcoal burners in the woods, and women washing linen at icy streams all learned to move steadily rather than quickly, conserving energy while accepting the slow creep of chill into muscle and bone. At midday, a brief pause beside a small portable brazier or a shared fire in a field shelter offered momentary relief, but the return to work meant surrendering that warmth again. In towns, artisans in unheated workshops, blacksmiths excepted, where forge heat was a mixed blessing, faced similar conditions. The cold slowed hands and stiffened leather or thread, turning ordinary tasks into quiet tests of endurance. Yet the cold was not only physical. It influenced social bonds and daily priorities in subtle but profound ways. The hearth drew families together each evening not merely for warmth but for the shared story of survival. Stories were told, tools repaired, wool carded, and plans made while clustered close to the fire's circle of light and heat. Neighbors might share a larger communal oven or kiln on baking days, the gathered bodies adding another layer of collective warmth. Monasteries and convents, though better organized, enforced their own disciplines around cold. Monks rose for prayers in unheated churches, their habits of heavy wool offering limited protection against stone floors that retained the night's chill long after sunrise. Even the nobility, in their more substantial manor houses or early castles, experienced versions of the same discomfort. Great halls with high ceilings and stone walls lost heat rapidly upward. Tapestries helped dampen drafts but could not eliminate them. Lords and ladies might retire to solar chambers with smaller fires, yet servants sleeping in the hall or on landings knew the deeper bite of the night air. What strikes the modern listener most, perhaps, is how thoroughly the cold wove itself into health and expectation. Chilblains, painful, itchy swellings on fingers, toes, and ears, were commonplace, as were persistent coughs and rheumatic aches that worsened with age. Infants and the elderly were especially vulnerable. The very young might be kept near the hearth in woven cradles, swaddled tightly, while the old bore the accumulated toll of decades spent never quite warm. Nutrition played its part too. Diets heavy in bread, pottage, and salted meat provided calories. Yet the body worked harder simply to maintain core temperature, leaving less reserve for fighting illness. The cold, in other words, was never merely uncomfortable. It was a background pressure that quietly shortened some lives and shaped the resilience of all. As the day lengthened into evening, the practical business of preparing for night began once more. Embers were raked together, a fresh log or peat block added with care, and shutters drawn tight against the wind. Families arranged their sleeping spaces to trap what warmth remained, sometimes sharing beds or lying back-to-back for mutual heat. The animals, if present, shifted closer to the human circle. Outside, the world grew still except for the occasional call of an owl or the rustle of wind through thatch. Inside, the cold settled in again, patient and familiar, waiting for the next dawn when the cycle would resume. Yet even this description only begins to capture the layered reality. To appreciate the full weight of that constant chill, we must follow those same villagers and townsfolk through an entire turning of the seasons, watching how their strategies adapted when frost hardened the ground or when summer rains brought new kinds of dampness. The coming of autumn, for instance, brought both harvest bounty and the knowledge that fuel stores must now be guarded jealously. We will turn next to those seasonal shifts and the small, ingenious ways medieval people coaxed warmth from their limited world, revealing how the cold, far from being a mere inconvenience, quietly ordered the priorities of an entire society. Those seasonal shifts began in earnest as the leaves turned bronze and gold across the fields of England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, and the first sharp winds carried the promise of months when the cold would demand its fullest attention. Autumn was not merely a time of harvest but a season of calculated preparation, when every able hand turned toward laying in stores that would determine comfort as much as survival. Coincided with the careful stockpiling of fuel, cartloads of kindling dragged from the woodland edges, peat turfs sliced from the moor and set out to dry on racks, and wherever possible, the felling of a carefully chosen tree under the Lord's permission. Families worked in quiet coordination, the rhythm of labor itself generating a measure of warmth that made the shortening days bearable. Children collected acorns and beech mast for the pigs, while women dried herbs and fruits on woven hurdles near the hearth, their fingers moving with practiced care to avoid the chill that stiffened joints after only an hour of exposure. The air itself changed. It grew heavier with the scent of wood smoke as every household tested its chimney or smoke hole, ensuring that the precious heat would not escape too readily when the true frosts arrived. What strikes us now as remarkable is how thoroughly these preparations wove the cold into the social fabric of the community. Manorial custom often dictated shared access to common resources, the right to gather firewood, to graze animals on the stubble fields, or to cut peat from the wastelands, and these rights were jealously guarded because they translated directly into warmth. A dispute over a few cartloads of brushwood could escalate into a matter for the manor court, not out of pettiness but because a single shortfall might mean nights when the hearth fire burned too low and children shivered under threadbare covers. Yet this same necessity fostered cooperation that felt almost instinctive. Neighbors exchanged labor during the busiest weeks, one family helping another thatch a roof in return for a share of the winter fuel, their combined bodies creating pockets of shared heat even as the sky lowered. In larger settlements, the coming of Michaelmas brought the annual accounting of rents and services, and with it the knowledge that the long indoor season was approaching, when the rhythms of work would slow and the hearth would become the undisputed center of existence. As the first hard frosts silvered the thatch and turned the paths to iron, the true weight of the cold settled in. Winter in the medieval countryside was a time of contraction. Livestock, carefully thinned in the autumn slaughter to reduce the mouths that needed feeding, were now stabled closer to the living quarters whenever possible, their breath and body heat adding a few welcome degrees to the single room. The surviving animals required constant attention. Cows had to be milked by lantern light before dawn, their udders cold to the touch and their flanks steaming in the frosty air. Water for drinking and cooking had to be fetched from wells or streams that might skin over with ice by mid-morning, the buckets themselves growing heavier as the liquid inside began to chill. Inside the homes, the floor rushes were renewed more frequently to combat the damp that rose from the earth. Yet they still carried the faint musty smell of moisture that never fully left. Families huddled closer at mealtimes, sharing a single large bowl of pottage thickened with whatever vegetables and grains had survived the harvest, the steam from the pot offering the only momentary cloud of warmth in the room. Bread, baked in communal ovens when fuel allowed, was torn and passed hand to hand, the crust still carrying a trace of oven heat that was savored like a small luxury. Clothing took on new urgency in these months. The layered wool garments that had served through milder seasons were now supplemented with every scrap of additional fabric a household possessed. A man might wrap his hose with strips of cloth or sheepskin, tying them securely below the knee to trap air warmed by movement. Women drew their kirtles tighter and added heavy mantles pinned at the shoulder, the wool sometimes treated with lanolin to shed the worst of the rain that accompanied so many winter days. For those who could afford it, a lining of rabbit or squirrel fur turned an ordinary cloak into something approaching true insulation, yet such furs were expensive and often inherited rather than purchased. Children's garments, already patched and recut from older siblings' clothes, were further reinforced with whatever remnants remained from the summer spinning. Gloves remained rare for daily labor. Instead, people learned to work with hands tucked into sleeves or warmed periodically against the body. The cold made every movement deliberate, bending to stir the fire, carrying a yoke of water, or mending a tool became acts that required a pause to rub life back into numb fingers. Yet these small discomforts were met not with complaint but with the quiet pragmatism that defined so much of medieval life. The body adjusted, the mind accepted, and the work continued because the alternative was hunger or worse. In the towns and the growing cities, the experience of cold carried its own distinct texture. Narrow streets funneled the wind between timber-framed houses whose upper stories jutted out, creating a canyon effect that intensified the chill. Artisans in their workshops, cobblers, weavers, potters, worked in spaces that were often no better insulated than rural cottages, though the proximity of neighbors sometimes meant that heat from adjacent forges or ovens seeped through shared walls. The guilds recognized the problem. Ordinances sometimes required that certain trades maintain a minimum fire during working hours, not for comfort but to keep materials from stiffening and tools from becoming too cold to handle precisely. At night, the watchmen patrolling the walls or the streets felt the cold most acutely, their cloaks and hoods offering only partial protection against the damp mist that rose from the river or the open drains. Yet even here, ingenuity found small victories. Public bathhouses, where they survived from earlier centuries, provided rare moments of enveloping steam and warmth, though they were more often seasonal luxuries than daily refuges. The wealthy burghers in their stone townhouses enjoyed the advantage of proper chimneys and glass windows, but even their servants sleeping in the attics or cellars knew the same penetrating chill that visited the countryside. Monastic communities, bound by their rules of poverty and discipline, faced the cold with a structured acceptance that turned discomfort into a form of devotion. In the great abbeys of Cluny or Citeaux, the stone cloisters and unheated chapter houses retained the night's frost long into the morning. Monks rose for the night office at 2 or 3 in the morning, their breath forming clouds as they chanted in the darkened church, woolen habits and scapulars providing the only barrier against flagstone floors that felt like ice beneath sandaled feet. The infirmary might offer a small fire for the sick, but the healthy endured the chill as part of the daily round, their hands tucked into sleeves during periods of silence, their bodies moving in the measured rhythm of the liturgy to generate internal heat. Yet even here practical adaptations appeared. The warming room, or kale factory, became a permitted space where a central fire allowed monks to thaw frozen fingers before returning to their duties. The scriptorium, where illuminated manuscripts took shape, relied on small braziers placed near the desks, their glow illuminating vellum and ink while reminding the copyists that the cold outside the circle of light was never far away. What modern sensibilities often misjudge is the way this constant presence of cold shaped not only the body but the very expectations of comfort itself. People did not live in a state of perpetual misery. Rather, they calibrated their lives around the cold's realities, finding satisfaction in small, hard-won victories over it. A well-banked fire that lasted until morning, a cloak that kept the worst drafts at bay, a shared pallet where body heat pooled. These were sources of genuine contentment. The cold also encouraged a deeper reliance on community and on the turning of the seasons themselves. As December deepened and the feast of Christmas approached, the long nights brought gatherings around the hearth for storytelling and song, the voices rising in carols that celebrated light in the midst of darkness. The Yule log, dragged in with ceremony, burned slowly and symbolically, its heat a reminder that even the deepest winter would eventually yield. Yet these moments of warmth were fleeting. The following dawn still required the same careful tending of embers, the same layering of clothes, the same steady endurance. By the time the midwinter solstice passed and the days began, almost imperceptibly, to lengthen, the accumulated effects of months spent never quite warm had left their mark. Joints ached more persistently, coughs lingered, and the very young and the elderly required extra vigilance. Yet the society had adapted, as it always did, through a web of custom, material ingenuity, and quiet resilience. The return of milder weather in early spring did not erase the memory of the cold. Instead, it prompted fresh calculations for the next cycle, repairs to thatch, the planting of fuel-bearing trees, the mending of winter-worn garments. The cold, it becomes clear, was never an interruption to medieval life but one of its defining conditions, quietly ordering priorities from the humblest cottage to the grandest hall. Even as the snows began to retreat and the first green shoots pushed through the thawed earth, another dimension of this long struggle with temperature revealed itself in the ways people navigated the uncertain border between winter and spring. The thawing ground brought its own hazards: mud that clung to shoes and chilled feet anew, flooding that turned low-lying homes damp once more, and with it came fresh strategies for coaxing warmth from a world still reluctant to release the frost entirely. We will follow those early spring adaptations next, tracing how the same practical intelligence that sustained families through the darkest months now turned toward rebuilding, replanting, and preparing for the cycle that would inevitably return. Those early spring adaptations began as the ground softened under the first tentative warmth of the sun. Yet the cold refused to relinquish its hold entirely, revealing itself instead in the persistent damp that turned every path into a ribbon of clinging mud. Villagers emerged from their winter hearths with a quiet sense of renewal, but their first tasks were shaped by the aftermath of frost and thaw. Thatched roofs, battered by winter gales and weighted with snow, often sagged or leaked, requiring fresh bundles of reed or straw to be layered and secured before the heavy spring rains arrived in earnest. Men climbed ladders or scaffolding of lashed poles, their fingers still stiff from months of limited warmth, while women and children gathered the materials from the edges of the common lands. The earth beneath their feet remained chilled and heavy. Boots and clogs sank inches deep, drawing moisture upward through the leather until feet felt perpetually clammy. Yet this same softening soil signaled the time for replanting, and families turned to the fields with the same measured pragmatism that had carried them through December's deepest chill. Seed corn saved from the previous harvest was scattered by hand across the open strips of the village fields, the sours moving slowly to conserve body heat while the wind still carried a bite that reddened cheeks and made eyes water. The transition from winter to spring was never abrupt, and the cold lingered in unexpected ways that tested the resilience built over the preceding months. Flooding in low-lying areas turned cottage floors into shallow pools of standing water, forcing households to raise their sleeping platforms higher on wooden blocks, or to spread additional layers of fresh rushes mixed with aromatic herbs to mask the mustiness. Livestock, now turned out to graze on the first tender shoots, still required shelter at night. The buyer attached to the house remained a vital source of shared warmth, though the animals' coats were shedding and their own discomfort from the damp added a new layer of stable odors and moisture to the living space. Children, whose growth had been slowed by the caloric demands of staying warm, now ran errands to the well or the common oven with lighter steps. Yet their patched garments offered little protection against the sudden downpours that could leave them shivering by midday. The practical intelligence that had sustained them through the darkest months now expressed itself in small repairs and reinforcements. Patching holes in the wattle with fresh daub made from clay and dung, tightening shutter hinges, and mending the woolen hose that had worn thin at the knees from kneeling at the hearth. Every such task carried the memory of the cold that had necessitated it, turning routine maintenance into a quiet affirmation of survival. As the days lengthened and the soil warmed fractionally, the rhythms of labor shifted once more toward the land. Plowing resumed in the heavy clay soils of northern Europe, the oxen or horses pulling the wooden ard or moldboard plow through earth that still held the night's chill deep in its layers. The plowman walked behind, his breath visible in the early morning air, his hands wrapped in rags or tucked into the sleeves of his tunic whenever the team paused. Women followed, breaking clods with mattocks or sowing the second wave of crops, barley, oats, peas, and beans, that would provide the pottage and bread for the coming year. The work generated its own heat, yet the dampness that rose from the turned furrows soaked through soles and leggings, creating a new kind of discomfort. Not the sharp bite of midwinter frost, but a pervasive, bone-wearying clamminess that made every evening's return to the hearth feel like a hard-won reward. In the evenings, families gathered again around the fire, now burning with a mix of the last winter fuel and the first green wood gathered from coppice trees, sharing the small bounty of early greens or a few eggs from hens that had begun laying once more. Stories turned from winter tales of endurance to plans for the summer markets. Yet the underlying awareness of the cold's eventual return kept the conversation practical rather than optimistic. Even in these milder weeks, the cold's influence extended into matters of health and community custom. The lingering damp encouraged the spread of respiratory ailments and skin conditions that had simmered through the winter. Chilblains that had cracked and bled in January now itched maddeningly as the weather fluctuated, and village healers, often older women versed in herbal lore, prepared infusions of yarrow or elderflower to ease the worst symptoms. Manorial records from the period show that labor services were sometimes adjusted in early spring to account for the reduced strength of tenants still recovering from the seasonal toll, a quiet recognition that the body's reserves had been spent keeping warm rather than growing strong. In the towns, the thaw brought its own challenges to artisans and merchants. Streets that had been frozen solid now became channels of filth and water, making the transport of goods slower and the workshops damper than ever. Cobblers worked extra hours repairing shoes ruined by the mud, their fingers nimble yet constantly cooled by the leather they handled. The guilds, ever mindful of the practical limits of their trades, sometimes permitted apprentices to warm their tools over small braziers, ensuring that metal did not contract and crack in the fluctuating temperatures. What becomes clear when examining these spring months is how thoroughly the medieval world had internalized the cold as a permanent condition rather than a temporary hardship. There was no illusion of perfect comfort awaiting in better weather. Instead, each season simply presented a new configuration of the same underlying challenge. The nobility, residing in manor houses of timber and stone, experienced a parallel but slightly elevated version of these realities. Their halls might boast larger hearths and the occasional tapestry to blunt drafts, yet the high ceilings still allowed heat to rise uselessly away, and the solar chambers reserved for the lord and lady were only marginally warmer than the servants' quarters. Ladies embroidered or spun while wrapped in fur-lined surcoats, their maids fetching coals for foot warmers that were refilled multiple times a day. Even the castle or manor kitchen, bustling with the preparation of salted meats and early spring vegetables, relied on constant fires whose smoke escaped through louvers rather than proper chimneys in many earlier structures. The contrast between image and reality was subtle but telling. The tapestries and carved furniture projected an air of stability, yet the people who lived among them understood that warmth remained a resource to be managed, not assumed. As spring advanced toward its full flowering, the strategies of preparation once again came to the fore. Families assessed their fuel stores and began the slow work of coppicing woodland edges or cutting fresh peat for drying, knowing that the cycle of scarcity would return with the autumn frosts. Gardens near the cottage door were planted with leeks, onions, and cabbages, crops that could be harvested late into the year and stored against the cold months ahead. The same hands that had banked embers through December now turned the soil with spades, the physical labor serving as both necessity and quiet therapy after the enforced closeness of winter. Children learned these patterns early, carrying water or gathering kindling with the same careful economy their parents displayed, absorbing the lesson that comfort was something earned through foresight rather than granted by the calendar. In monastic settings, the shift was marked by the liturgical calendar as much as the weather. The move from Lent's austerity toward Easter brought slightly lighter diets and the resumption of outdoor labor in the abbey gardens. Yet the stone walls of the cloister retained their chill, reminding the monks that spiritual discipline and physical endurance remained intertwined. The approach of full summer, when the days grew long and the fields ripened, did not erase these habits but rather layered new ones atop them. Nights, though shorter, could still turn cool and damp, especially in the northern regions where coastal mists rolled inland or upland winds carried the memory of higher ground. Harvest preparations began in earnest, with scythes sharpened and carts repaired, the workers rising before dawn when the air still held a crisp edge that made the first hours of labor feel almost wintry. Clothing was adjusted once more, lighter linens beneath wool tunics that could be shed during the heat of midday yet reclaimed when the sun dipped low. Yet even here the cold's long shadow influenced daily choices. Stored grain had to be watched for mold encouraged by residual dampness, woolens aired in the sun to prevent mildew, and the hearth kept ready for sudden evening chills that could spoil a night's rest. The market days that dotted the calendar brought villagers together in greater numbers, their conversations turning inevitably to the coming winter even as they bartered for salt or iron goods that would make the next cold season more manageable. This seamless weaving of seasons into a single, continuous negotiation with temperature underscores a deeper truth about medieval existence. The cold was not a series of isolated events but the quiet architecture within which all other aspects of life unfolded: work, family, faith, and community. As the summer solstice passed and the days once again began their slow shortening, the practical intelligence that had carried families from the mud of spring through the promise of harvest now turned its gaze forward once more, anticipating the moment when the first leaves would yellow and the cycle of gathering and conserving would resume in earnest. The same rhythms that had sustained them through the previous winter's depths were already being recalibrated, ensuring that when the frost returned, the hearth would be ready, the stores would hold, and the quiet endurance that defined their world would continue unbroken. Yet to fully appreciate the texture of that endurance, we must look closer at how the cold shaped not only the countryside but the expanding urban centers and the great trading networks that linked them, where the same fundamental challenge assumed new forms amid timbered streets and crowded marketplaces. We will turn next to those urban realities and the ways merchants, craftsmen, and city dwellers adapted their own strategies for warmth, revealing how the cold's influence extended far beyond the village hearth into the broader economic and social currents of the age. Those urban realities unfolded in the growing towns and cities of medieval Europe, where the same unyielding presence of cold assumed new shapes amid timber-framed houses that crowded together along narrow, winding streets. Unlike the scattered villages where each household negotiated its own quiet truce with the elements, the towns concentrated both the problem and the partial solutions. In places such as London, Paris, Bruges, or the bustling Hanseatic ports of the north, the close-built construction created a kind of collective microclimate. Upper stories jutted outward on jetty brackets, forming overhangs that shielded pedestrians from rain yet trapped damp air and funneled winter winds into tunnels of chill. The streets themselves, often unpaved or only partially cobbled, turned to thick mud with the first autumn rains and froze into rutted ice by December, making every journey on foot or by cart an exercise in careful footing. Merchants and apprentices hurried between warehouses and market stalls with their cloaks pulled tight, their breath visible against the backdrop of timber and plaster that offered little more insulation than the rural wattle and daub they had left behind. Craft workshops became the new hearths of daily survival. A weaver in a Cologne tenement might labor at a broad loom in a ground-floor room whose single window, covered only with oiled linen or horn in the earlier centuries, admitted more draught than light. The wool he worked retained some warmth when handled, yet the constant motion of the treadle and the dampness that seeped through the floorboards left his hands raw by mid-afternoon. Guild ordinances recognized these conditions. In many towns, regulations required that certain trades, fullers, dyers, tanners, maintain a fire during working hours, not for comfort alone but because cold-stiffened fibers snapped more easily and dyes refused to set properly in chilled vats. The blacksmith enjoyed the fierce heat of his forge, yet the rest of his shop remained frigid, and the apprentices who pumped the bellows or quenched hot iron in icy water learned to rotate their tasks so that no one endured the worst of the chill for too long. At night, the same workshops often doubled as sleeping quarters. The master and his family retired to a chamber above, while journeymen and apprentices curled on pallets near the dying embers of the day's fire, their shared body heat mingling with the residual warmth of cooled metal and stone. Markets, the pulsing heart of urban commerce, brought their own seasonal negotiations with temperature. The great fairs of Champagne or the weekly stalls of a Flemish cloth town operated year-round, yet winter trading days required careful choreography. Vendors erected temporary stalls of canvas and wood, lining them with straw to blunt the cold rising from the ground, and kept small braziers burning beneath their counters to warm their hands between transactions. Buyers moved briskly, comparing bolts of woolen broadcloth or barrels of salted herring, while stamping their feet against the frozen cobbles. The cold slowed bargaining and made every coin feel heavier in gloved or mittened palms. A merchant who allowed his fingers to grow too numb might miscalculate a price or drop a measure of grain. Yet these same markets revealed the ingenuity that cold encouraged. Public ovens, licensed by the town authorities and heated with shared fuel contributions, allowed households without their own substantial hearth to bake bread or warm a pot of stew, the queue of citizens standing shoulder to shoulder creating a fleeting pocket of collective warmth. Bathhouses, surviving from Roman precedent in some regions or newly established in others, offered rare respites of steam and heated water, though they were more often visited in the colder months when the contrast with the outside air felt most precious, and the risk of fire from their furnaces most closely watched. The rise of chimneys in the later Middle Ages marked one of the quiet technological responses to this persistent discomfort, yet even this innovation spread unevenly and brought its own limitations. In the stone townhouses of prosperous merchants and guild masters, proper flues began to replace open roof holes, carrying smoke upward and allowing fires to burn more efficiently without filling the room. A well-to-do family in 14th-century York might enjoy a private solar with a fireplace set into the wall, its carved stone surround decorated with the owner's mark of status. Yet the heat still rose quickly to the high ceilings, and the lower floors, where servants and apprentices slept, remained as cold as ever. Glass windows, increasingly common among the wealthy, reduced drafts far better than shutters alone, but they were expensive and fragile. A cracked pane could undo months of careful fuel budgeting. For the majority who lived in rented rooms or cramped alleys, these advances remained distant luxuries. The damp that clung to unheated cellars and attics fostered mold and illness, and the narrow courts between buildings trapped fog and smoke, so that the air itself felt heavier and colder than in the open countryside. Trade networks that linked these cities to distant regions carried the influence of cold even farther. The wool ships sailing from English ports to Flanders in winter faced gales and sleet that stiffened ropes and chilled crews to the bone. Sailors layered every garment they owned and still huddled below decks when the wind allowed, their bodies drawing on the same practical endurance that sustained the landbound. Inland, pack trains of mules or carts moved salt, spices, and Baltic timber along roads that became impassable after heavy snow, forcing merchants to calculate not only profit but the literal caloric cost of keeping their men and animals warm enough to continue. The Hanseatic League's cantors in Novgorod or Bergen operated through long dark winters, their warehouses insulated with bales of wool or furs, yet still requiring constant fires tended by watchmen who rotated shifts to avoid freezing. The cold, in these contexts, shaped economic decisions as surely as supply and demand. Contracts included clauses for delayed delivery due to frost, and warehouses were designed with raised floors to combat damp that could ruin stored cloth or grain. Religious institutions within the towns mirrored and sometimes amplified these urban patterns. Cathedrals and collegiate churches, with their vast stone vaults and expansive windows, retained the chill of the surrounding air long after sunrise. Canons and priests performing the daily offices in unheated choirs wrapped their cassocks in additional wool and moved with deliberate slowness to conserve warmth, their chants rising in visible clouds. The hospitals attached to monasteries or guilds provided one of the few places where the poorest urban dwellers could seek shelter from the worst nights. Though beds were simple straw pallets and fires were kept modest to conserve resources for the sick. Even here the cold was never fully banished. It simply became part of the charitable calculus, a reminder that mercy in the medieval city meant offering not perfect comfort but shared endurance. What emerges from these urban scenes is a picture of adaptation that was at once more concentrated and more inventive than in the countryside. The proximity of neighbors and the density of trades created opportunities for shared heat that a lone village could not match, yet it also magnified the risks: fire that could leap from one timber house to the next in minutes, or the rapid spread of illness through crowded, unventilated rooms. The cold, far from being an equalizing force, revealed the subtle gradations of wealth and status more clearly than any sumptuary law. The merchant who could afford glass and a chimney lived in a noticeably different climate from the apprentice who shared a pallet with 3 others. Yet even the prosperous understood that warmth remained a managed resource, never to be taken for granted. As the 14th century progressed and the cooling trends of the Little Ice Age deepened their grip, these urban strategies were tested more severely. Harvest failures in the countryside sent waves of migrants into the towns seeking work and shelter, increasing pressure on fuel supplies and living space. Town councils responded with ordinances regulating the price and distribution of firewood, and in some cases with communal stockpiles set aside for the poorest households. The same cold that slowed trade and stiffened fingers also prompted new forms of cooperation. Guilds pooling resources for a common warming room, neighbors sharing the cost of a night watchman who kept public braziers alight in the market square. These measures were practical rather than sentimental, born of the recognition that unchecked cold threatened not only individual comfort but the orderly functioning of the entire community. The experience of the urban middle classes and laborers thus formed another layer in the broader tapestry of medieval cold, one that connected the village hearth to the wider currents of commerce and governance. Yet even these accounts leave room for the contrasting world of the nobility and the great ecclesiastical estates, where resources allowed for more elaborate defenses against the chill, and where the cold's influence expressed itself in the architecture of power itself. We will turn next to the manor houses, castles, and monastic complexes where the daily negotiation with temperature took on grander forms, revealing how even those at the apex of society remained subject to the same fundamental constraint that shaped the lives of peasants and townsfolk alike. In the manor houses, castles, and monastic complexes, the daily negotiation with temperature took on grander forms, yet the fundamental constraint remained unchanged. Stone and timber, no matter how imposing, could not trap warmth indefinitely, and the cold continued to dictate the shape of power, piety, and routine much as it did in the humblest cottage. A typical 13th century English manor house, built of oak beams and infilled with wattle, might boast a great hall 30 or 40 feet high, its roof supported by massive crux or king-post trusses. The central hearth, often still open to the rafters in earlier examples, sent smoke curling upward through a louver in the thatch or tiles, carrying away precious heat along with it. Tapestries hung on the walls to deaden draughts and display lineage, yet they swayed gently in the perpetual currents that slipped through unglazed windows or around ill-fitting shutters. At night the fire was banked with ash and turf to conserve fuel for the following day, leaving the hall to cool rapidly. Servants rolled out pallets on the rush-strewn floor while the lord and lady withdrew to a solar chamber that, though smaller and sometimes equipped with a wall fireplace by the 14th century, still lost warmth upward through its own high ceiling. The contrast between the public image of feudal authority and the private reality of chilled feet and visible breath was quietly understood by all who lived within those walls. Noble clothing reflected both status and the practical need to insulate the body against that ever-present chill. A lord might wear a fur-lined houppelande of fine wool, its voluminous sleeves and high collar trapping layers of warm air, while his wife layered kirtles, surcoats, and a mantle edged with squirrel or miniver. These garments were heavy, luxurious in texture, yet they still absorbed the dampness that seeped from stone floors and unheated corridors. Children of the household, dressed in scaled-down versions of adult attire, learned early that movement itself was the most reliable source of warmth. Games in the bailey or lessons beside the fire were interrupted by the need to stamp feet or rub hands together. Servants, by contrast, wore simpler woolens patched and re-dyed, their livery sometimes padded with additional layers beneath, yet they spent long hours in the draughty kitchens, butteries, and stables where the temperature hovered only a few degrees above the outdoor air. The kitchen itself, with its great spits and cauldrons, generated fierce localized heat, but the scullions who carried water or turned the roasting meat felt the cold keenly whenever they stepped beyond the immediate glow of the fires. Even the most elaborate feast, with its roasted swan, spiced wines, and minstrels, could not banish the chill entirely. Guests seated farthest from the high table often drew their cloaks closer as the evening wore on, the music and conversation rising against the subtle backdrop of discomfort. Castles amplified these realities on a still larger scale. Built initially for defense, their thick curtain walls and soaring keeps retained the cold like vast refrigerators of stone. Early Norman examples relied on open hearths in the Great Hall, with smoke escaping through roof vents or arrow slits. Later developments added fireplaces and chimneys, yet the sheer volume of space meant that warmth never reached the upper galleries or the guard chambers in the towers. Sentries on the battlements in January felt the wind slice through every gap in their mail and gambeson. Their watches measured not only by the turning of the hourglass but by the gradual numbing of fingers around the spear shaft. Inside, the lady's solar might be furnished with cushions, braziers, and embroidered hangings, yet the stone floors beneath the carpets remained icy to the touch, and foot warmers filled with hot coals were refilled constantly by waiting maids. The chapel, often the most ornate room in the complex, stood unheated except for the body heat of those attending Mass. Knights and ladies knelt on prie-dieu while their breath formed faint clouds before the altar. Even the privy chambers, set into the thickness of the walls, were notoriously cold, their chutes open to the elements and their wooden seats offering no insulation against the draught that rose from below. Monastic complexes, whether Benedictine or Cistercian, approached the same challenge with a blend of architectural ambition and spiritual discipline. The great abbey churches of the 12th and 13th centuries, vast stone vaults rising 80 feet or more, were designed for the glory of God rather than bodily comfort. Monks chanted the offices at all hours, their woolen habits and cowls providing the primary barrier against flagstones that held the night's frost until well after terce. The cloister walk, open to the elements on one side, funneled winter winds around the square, and the chapter house where daily business was conducted often remained as cold as the church itself. Practical concessions existed. The kale factory, or warming room, with its central hearth, allowed a brief respite for chilled hands before copying manuscripts or returning to manual labor in the gardens and fields. Infirmaries kept small fires for the sick, yet the healthy endured the cold as part of the rule, their bodies adapting through the steady rhythm of work, prayer, and minimal sustenance. Abbots and priors, housed in somewhat more comfortable apartments, still understood that the monastery's wealth, lands, tithes, and endowments, translated only partially into warmth. Even the finest imported glass in the refectory windows could not prevent heat from escaping upward into the night. What these elite environments reveal is a subtle but persistent irony. The very symbols of medieval power, stone towers, vaulted halls, and displays of wealth, often intensified the experience of cold rather than alleviating it. High ceilings and expansive spaces, chosen for grandeur and defensibility, worked against the conservation of heat. Fuel management became an exercise in lordly administration. Accounts from manorial rolls and abbey ledgers record meticulous tallies of wood, charcoal, and peat, with strict allocations to prevent waste. A great lord might host a Christmas feast that blazed with Yule logs and candles, the hall filled with the scent of roasted meats and mulled wine. Yet the following morning the same servants who had cleared the tables would be scraping ash from a hearth that had burned through a month's supply in a single night. The cold thus imposed a quiet discipline on even the highest ranks, reminding them that authority rested not only on land and lineage but on the careful husbandry of resources that kept the household functional through the long winter months. Daily routines in these settings adapted around the cold with the same pragmatic intelligence seen in the villages and towns. Morning prayers or manor court sessions began while the air was still sharp, participants moving with deliberate slowness to preserve body heat. Midday meals, though more varied than peasant pottage, were often eaten quickly so that work, overseeing accounts, training men-at-arms, or tending the scriptorium, could resume before stiffness set in. Evening gatherings around the fire became the true center of social and political life. Here news was exchanged, alliances formed, and stories told while the flames cast long shadows across the tapestries. Servants slept in shifts near the dying embers, their presence adding another layer of communal warmth that the nobility tacitly relied upon. In monasteries the pattern was more rigidly scheduled, yet the same principle held. The body's need for heat shaped the timetable of devotion as surely as the bells. As the 14th century unfolded and the climate continued its gradual cooling, these grander households and religious houses faced mounting pressures. Poorer harvests meant thinner fuel supplies and higher prices for imported wood or charcoal. Town records and royal writs show repeated attempts to regulate the trade in firewood to prevent shortages that could threaten both commoner and noble alike. Castles built in earlier centuries proved increasingly difficult to heat efficiently, prompting some lords to construct smaller, more manageable lodgings within the curtain walls. Monasteries, burdened by their extensive estates, redirected labor toward peat cutting and coppicing on a larger scale. Yet the dampness that accompanied the changing weather still penetrated even the thickest stone. The cold, far from diminishing with status, simply manifested in more elaborate forms of management, ledgers instead of verbal calculations, stone fireplaces instead of open hearths. Yet the underlying sensation of never being quite warm remained a shared human constant across every stratum of society. This layered experience of cold in the halls of power and prayer thus formed yet another thread in the intricate fabric of medieval life, one that connected the routines of the elite to the daily struggles of those who served them. The same quiet calculations that guided a peasant's fuel gathering echoed in the steward's careful entries in the account rolls, revealing a society bound together by the common need to outwit the chill. As we move deeper into the later Middle Ages, however, new pressures and innovations began to alter the terms of this long negotiation. Shifts in architecture, in trade, and in the very climate itself that would test the resilience built over centuries. The story continues with the ways these grand establishments adapted to the deepening grip of the Little Ice Age, where the cold's influence extended into matters of governance, warfare, and the slow transformation of daily existence in ways that would echo far beyond the medieval world. Those grand establishments adapted to the deepening grip of the Little Ice Age through a combination of intensified resource management and incremental architectural adjustments. As the winters grew longer and more severe from the early 14th century onward, bringing deeper frosts, heavier snows, and prolonged periods of damp that tested even the most carefully provisioned households. In the great manor houses and royal residences, stewards began keeping more meticulous records of fuel consumption, allocating specific quotas of firewood or charcoal not only for the lord's chamber but for the entire retinue, recognizing that a single harsh season could exhaust stores laid by over 2 or 3 milder years. Coppicing rights on estate woodlands were enforced with greater rigor, and in some regions additional peat bogs were drained and exploited, their turfs stacked in vast drying sheds to ensure a supply that burned slower and steadier than greenwood. Castles that had once relied on open hearths now saw the gradual installation of more efficient fireplaces with hoods and flues, yet the work was costly and slow. Masons chiseled new channels through walls that were already centuries old, while the masons themselves worked in the biting winds that whipped around scaffolding draped with tarpaulins. Monasteries, with their extensive granges and tithe barns, redirected lay brothers toward the systematic harvesting of timber and the maintenance of fish ponds that could be accessed even when rivers froze, turning the cold itself into a calendar that dictated when certain labors could safely occur. The influence of this deepening cold extended unmistakably into matters of governance, where the practical necessities of warmth reshaped the rhythms of administration and justice. Royal and noble progresses, the great seasonal journeys by which kings and lords maintained authority over their lands, grew shorter and more cautious during the worst decades of the 14th and 15th centuries. A monarch such as Edward III of England or his French counterparts might curtail winter travel between castles, choosing instead to hold court in a single well-provisioned residence where fuel could be stockpiled in advance, rather than risk the frozen roads and the exhaustion of men and horses. Manorial courts, once convened outdoors or in unheated halls when weather permitted, were increasingly moved indoors to the great chamber, where the fire's limited circle of warmth allowed suitors and witnesses to speak without their teeth chattering audibly. Records from the period note delays in the collection of rents or the hearing of disputes when snow blocked the paths, forcing officials to rely on written depositions carried by messengers who wrapped their documents in oiled leather to protect them from the damp. Even the great councils of state, gathered around tables laden with parchment and wax seals, conducted their business with feet tucked against foot warmers or wrapped in heavy rugs, the cold concentrating minds on efficiency rather than prolonged debate. What had once been a mobile exercise of power became, in part, a stationary negotiation with the elements, revealing how the cold quietly constrained the reach of authority without diminishing its formal claims. In warfare, the cold's hand was equally decisive, transforming campaigns that might have been swift summer affairs into grueling tests of endurance that lasted through frost and thaw alike. During the 100 Years' War, English and French armies found themselves bogged down not only by mud but by the deeper chill that stiffened bowstrings, rusted armor, and turned supply lines into gauntlets of hardship. Soldiers on the march layered every garment they possessed, padded jacks beneath mail, woolen hose reinforced with leather, yet the constant damp rotted leather straps and made boots heavy with absorbed water. Camps pitched near besieged towns relied on hastily dug fire pits, but fuel was scarce in ravaged countrysides, and men huddled beneath canvas tents that offered little more protection than the open sky. Sieges stretched into winter months, the defenders within castle walls rationing their own stores while attackers outside suffered the greater exposure. The fall of a stronghold sometimes owed as much to the silent attrition of chilblains and respiratory ailments as to the force of arms. Naval engagements in the Channel or the North Sea faced gales that coated rigging with ice, forcing crews to chip away at frozen ropes with numb hands, while the ships themselves rolled in waters that chilled any man overboard within minutes. Commanders learned to time their movements around the calendar of cold, launching offensives in the fleeting weeks of milder weather and wintering in fortified towns where communal fires and shared billets offered the only reliable warmth. The cold, in these contexts, acted as a silent strategist, leveling some advantages of numbers or technology and reminding even the most ambitious rulers that their ambitions were bounded by the body's need to stay warm. Yet the slow transformation of daily existence in these grand settings was perhaps most telling in the intimate adjustments that accumulated over generations. Clothing evolved toward heavier, more voluminous styles. The houppelande gave way to layered gowns and mantles lined with imported furs from the Baltic or Russia, traded at considerable expense precisely because they retained heat where wool alone could not. Diet shifted subtly as well, with greater emphasis on hot spiced wines, thickened broths, and roasted meats that provided internal warmth as much as sustenance, while kitchens experimented with covered pots and slow braising to extract every degree of heat from the fuel. Sleeping arrangements became more communal even among the nobility. Families and retainers might share larger beds or curtained alcoves in the solar, drawing heavy drapes to trap body heat in a way that echoed the peasant practice of huddling under shared cloaks. In monastic houses, the Little Ice Age prompted small but meaningful concessions within the rule: additional allowances for a warming drink before matins, or the temporary relocation of scriptoria closer to the kale factory, without ever admitting that comfort had become a necessity. Gardens and orchards were replanted with hardier varieties that could survive late frosts, and fish ponds were deepened to prevent complete freezing, ensuring a winter food supply that sustained both body and spirit. These adaptations were never presented as dramatic revolutions. They unfolded gradually, as practical responses to a world that was simply growing colder and wetter year by year. Account books from manors and abbeys reveal the quiet calculus. One extra cartload of wood budgeted against the risk of a late spring, or the purchase of additional glass for windows in a solar that had previously relied on shutters alone. The cold thus wove itself more deeply into the structures of power, turning what might have been abstract feudal obligations into tangible questions of fuel and shelter. Lords who could once display generosity through lavish feasts now weighed the cost of every extra log against the need to maintain their household's health and readiness. The same constraint that pressed upon the peasant's hearth pressed, in different measure, upon the castle's keep, creating a shared vocabulary of endurance that crossed social boundaries even as it highlighted the differences in resources. As the 15th century advanced and the grip of the Little Ice Age tightened further, these grand establishments found themselves negotiating not only with the weather but with the broader social and economic ripples it created. Harvest failures in the countryside sent ripples of scarcity upward, increasing the price of grain and fuel and forcing even wealthy households to tighten their belts and their hearths. Royal decrees attempted to regulate the trade in firewood and to protect woodlands from overexploitation, while monastic orders expanded their charitable distributions of bread and ale to the poor during the worst months, recognizing that unchecked suffering outside the walls could destabilize the order within. The cold's influence, once confined largely to the rhythms of the seasons, now began to shape longer-term decisions about land use, inheritance, and the very layout of power. Yet even these measures remained provisional, part of an ongoing dialogue with a climate that refused to relent. The deepening integration of cold into the machinery of governance and warfare thus set the stage for further transformations that would ripple outward from the great halls and cloisters into the wider networks of trade and daily labor that sustained them. We will turn next to how these pressures influenced the merchant classes and the emerging urban economies, where the same chill that shaped royal strategy now dictated the flow of goods, the timing of markets, and the quiet ingenuity of those who moved between the worlds of the manor and the marketplace. Those pressures influenced the merchant classes and the emerging urban economies in ways that turned the cold from a mere seasonal inconvenience into a quiet force reshaping the flow of goods, the timing of markets, and the calculated risks taken by those who moved between the manor and the marketplace. In the trading cities of the Low Countries, the Italian peninsula, and the Hanseatic ports along the Baltic, merchants who had once timed their caravans and ships around the rhythms of harvest and fair now found themselves negotiating with a climate that lengthened the frozen months and shortened the reliable sailing seasons. A wool merchant in Bruges or a spice trader in Venice might rise before dawn in a timbered counting house where the hearth fire, though better tended than in rural cottages, still struggled to reach the upper floors where ledgers were stored. The cold stiffened the quill in his hand and made the wax seals brittle, so that every entry in the account book carried the faint tremor of chilled fingers. Warehouses along the quays, built of sturdy oak and brick, were raised on pilings to combat damp, yet the air inside remained perpetually cool and moist. Bales of English wool or barrels of salted herring had to be rotated and inspected more frequently to prevent mold fostered by the lingering frost, and watchmen huddled near small braziers that burned through the night at considerable expense. The overland trade routes that linked these cities to the hinterlands became especially unforgiving as the Little Ice Age tightened its hold. Pack trains of mules or ox-drawn carts laden with cloth, iron, or grain moved along roads that turned treacherous with ice and deep ruts once the autumn rains gave way to hard freezes. Drivers wrapped their legs in straw-stuffed leggings and kept their hands inside their cloaks, pausing at wayside inns where the shared fire offered only temporary relief before the next stage of the journey. Fuel stops were planned with the same precision once reserved for tolls and tariffs. A merchant's factor might calculate not only the profit margin on a shipment of Flemish broadcloth, but the additional cost of extra charcoal to keep the men and animals from slowing to a dangerous crawl. River transport, once a reliable alternative, often froze solid for weeks at a time, forcing goods to wait in riverside sheds where the cold preserved some items, such as salted fish or frozen meat, but ruined others, like unprocessed wool that absorbed moisture and began to rot. The cold thus inserted itself into every contract and bill of lading, prompting clauses that accounted for acts of God and weather with a realism born of repeated experience rather than legal formality. Within the urban marketplaces themselves, the daily commerce adapted through small, cumulative innovations that spoke to the same practical intelligence seen in the villages. Stalls were reinforced with heavier canvas awnings and lined with straw bales to create pockets of still air. Vendors kept foot warmers filled with coals beneath their counters and sold hot chestnuts or mulled ale, as much for the warmth they provided the buyer as for the modest profit. Guild halls, where merchants gathered to settle disputes or elect officers, maintained larger hearths and sometimes installed the new wall fireplaces that allowed smoke to escape more efficiently. Yet even these rooms grew chill by late afternoon when the crowds thinned. The timing of the great fairs shifted subtly. The Champagne fairs, once spanning summer and autumn, saw their winter sessions curtailed or moved indoors to covered halls where braziers and shared body heat could sustain the bargaining. A transaction that might have taken minutes in milder weather now stretched longer as hands were rubbed together and cloaks adjusted. Yet the merchants accepted the delay because the alternative, halting trade entirely, risked the collapse of the delicate credit networks that bound the economy together. What becomes evident in these urban trading worlds is a subtle reversal of expectation. The cold, while it slowed movement and raised costs, also fostered a sharper commercial discipline and a network of mutual reliance that crossed national and social lines. A Hanseatic merchant in Lübeck might correspond with his counterpart in London not only about prices but about the depth of ice in the harbor, sharing intelligence that allowed both to adjust their shipments and avoid ruinous losses. Shipmasters in the Baltic learned to reinforce hulls against ice and to carry extra stores of dried peas and salt pork that could be heated quickly over a ship's small galley fire, turning the vessel itself into a floating hearth during the long dark crossings. The same dampness that plagued warehouses encouraged the development of better packing techniques, oiled cloths, layered straw, and sealed barrels that protected goods from the elements and, in turn, stimulated demand for the very materials that kept people warm. Furs from Novgorod, wool from England, and peat from the Low Countries flowed along these chilled arteries, each shipment carrying the invisible imprint of the temperature that had preserved or threatened it. Even the emerging banking and credit systems felt the cold's indirect touch. Moneylenders and factors in Florence or Antwerp worked in rooms where the chill slowed the counting of coins and the drying of ink, prompting the use of small portable stoves that could be moved between desks. Loans for winter voyages carried higher interest to offset the greater risk of delay or loss, and the ledgers themselves were kept closer to the fire to prevent the parchment from curling in the damp. Apprentices, sleeping in the attics or cellars of these counting houses, endured the same penetrating cold as their rural counterparts. Yet their daily labor, hauling bales, tallying cargo, running messages through frozen streets, built a resilience that served the larger economic machine. The cold, far from being an obstacle to trade, became one of its silent partners, compelling efficiency and foresight in ways that milder climates might not have demanded. As the 15th century progressed, these merchant networks began to intersect more visibly with the royal and noble worlds we glimpsed earlier. Kings and dukes, seeking to stabilize their revenues amid climatic uncertainty, granted charters and privileges to trading companies precisely because the flow of goods, and the taxes they generated, offered a buffer against the shortages that cold weather could bring. A royal monopoly on the wool staple in England, for instance, was administered from warehouses that were themselves heated with the same careful economy as any manor hall, the official stamping documents with cold-stiffened fingers while calculating how much fleece could be exported before domestic looms ran short. The quiet ingenuity of these merchants, moving between the manor and the marketplace, thus wove the experience of cold into the very fabric of emerging capitalism, where temperature was no longer merely a fact of nature but a variable in the ledger of profit and survival. This integration of cold into the commercial currents of the age also began to influence the smaller domestic economies that supported the larger ones, the workshops of artisans who supplied the merchants and the households of the urban middling sort who depended on the steady arrival of fuel and food. We will turn next to those everyday urban households and the ways their intimate negotiations with chill mirrored yet subtly diverged from both the peasant hearth and the noble hall, revealing how the cold continued to shape family life, child-rearing, and the quiet transmission of practical knowledge from one generation to the next even as the medieval world edged toward its close-in those everyday urban households of the later Middle Ages. The intimate negotiations with chill mirrored the patterns of the peasant hearth while diverging in ways that reflected the denser, more commercial environment of the town, revealing how the cold continued to shape family life, child-rearing, and the quiet transmission of practical knowledge from one generation to the next even as the medieval world edged toward its close. A typical merchant's or artisan's house in a city like York or Ghent stood 3 or 4 stories tall, its timber frame filled with plaster and lath, the ground floor given over to a workshop or shop front while the family lived above. The main living chamber, often called the solar or hall depending on the region, contained a central hearth that by the 15th century usually vented through a proper chimney, yet the heat still rose swiftly to the rafters and left the lower reaches of the room noticeably cooler. Families arranged their days around that single source of warmth. Meals were taken close to the fire, with children seated on low stools or cushions to keep their feet from the draft that slipped under the door. At night, pallets or curtained beds were pulled nearer the embers, and the family might share a single large coverlet of wool or patched furs, their bodies forming a compact knot of warmth that echoed the village practice yet felt more contained within the narrow plot of urban land. Children learned the lessons of cold almost as soon as they could walk. Infants were swaddled tightly in linen and wool, placed in cradles rocked near the hearth, so that the mother or elder sister could tend the fire without leaving the baby exposed to the sharper air near the windows. As toddlers, they were taught to bank embers carefully before bed, using a long-handled rake to push the coals together and cover them with ash, preserving the glow until morning. Older children fetched kindling from the backyard pile or carried buckets of water that had often skimmed with ice by the time they reached the door, their small hands chapped and reddened from the repeated exposure. Parents passed on the knowledge not through formal instruction but through the steady rhythm of shared tasks. A father showing his son how to twist straw into tight bundles that burned longer than loose twigs, or a mother demonstrating how to layer a child's kirtle with an extra strip of cloth at the hem to trap air warmed by movement. These lessons carried a quiet urgency. A single careless spark or an overlooked draft could mean a night of shivering that left everyone less able to face the next day's labor. The cold thus became an unspoken teacher, instilling habits of foresight and economy that would serve the next generation when they stepped into apprenticeships or set up their own households. Daily routines reflected this domestic choreography. The morning fire was coaxed back to life while the household still lay under covers. The first warmth used to heat a pot of watered ale or thin porridge that provided internal comfort before anyone ventured into the street. Wives and daughters spun or carded wool beside the hearth during the shorter winter days, their fingers moving rhythmically while the children played quiet games on the floor rushes that were renewed more often to combat the damp rising from below. Fathers returning from the workshop or market brought the day's news along with whatever small fuel purchase the budget allowed. Perhaps a sack of charcoal from the riverside vendor or a bundle of faggots bought on credit until the next market day. Evenings drew the family closer together. Stories of saints or local heroes were told while hands were warmed at the flames, and the mending of hose or the patching of a cloak became occasions for gentle correction and encouragement. The cold encouraged a particular kind of closeness, not the forced intimacy of a single-room cottage, but a chosen huddling within a multi-room house where corridors and stairwells remained unheated and therefore largely unused in winter. Privacy was a luxury reserved for the wealthiest. Most families accepted the shared space as the price of survival, and the hearth became the true center of emotional as well as physical life. Health and expectation were quietly molded by these conditions. Persistent coughs and rheumatic aches were accepted as part of the turning year, treated with herbal infusions kept warm on the hearthstone, or with poultices of mustard and linseed applied before bed. Chilblains on small fingers and toes were common among children, the swollen skin rubbed with goose grease or wrapped in clean rags until the next thaw brought relief. Parents watched their young with a practiced eye, noting when a child's energy flagged, or when a persistent chill signaled the need to keep them closer to the fire for an extra day. Nutrition played its part too. The household diet of bread, pottage, salted meat, and the occasional fresh fish from the market was chosen partly for its ability to fuel the body's constant effort to maintain core temperature. A well-stocked larder meant not only full bellies but a margin of resilience against the cold's drain on strength. In this way, the cold shaped child-rearing toward resilience rather than indulgence, teaching endurance through small, repeated discomforts that prepared the young for the adult world outside the door. Yet the urban setting offered subtle divergences from rural life. The proximity of neighbors meant that warmth could sometimes be shared across property lines. A baker's oven next door might radiate enough heat through a shared wall to make the adjacent chamber noticeably less frigid, and families occasionally paid a small fee to use a guild-owned warming room or public bakehouse during the worst nights. The marketplace itself provided occasional respites. Hot pies sold from street stalls or the brief shelter of a covered arcade where merchants gathered. Children running errands learned to time their journeys between pockets of warmth, ducking into a church porch or a neighbor's shop to rub feeling back into their hands. The transmission of knowledge, therefore, included these urban shortcuts. Which streets caught the least wind, which vendors sold the cheapest kindling, and how to judge the quality of peat by its weight and smell so that the family's fuel lasted longer. These lessons were practical, localized, and passed mouth to ear, forming a living archive of adaptation that changed slowly with each generation. As the 15th century drew toward its end and the medieval world began its gradual transition into new economic and cultural patterns, these household strategies remained rooted in the same fundamental negotiation with temperature. The introduction of coal in some regions, carried by coastal shipping from northern England or the Low Countries, promised a hotter, more sustained burn than wood or peat, yet it required new grates and chimneys and carried its own problems of smoke and cost. Families experimented cautiously, weighing the expense against the promise of fewer nights spent feeding the fire every few hours. At the same time, The growing availability of imported textiles and furs through expanding trade networks allowed even middling households to add a rabbit-lined hood or a heavier wool surcoat, small luxuries that eased the burden without eliminating it. The cold, in other words, continued to evolve alongside the society it shaped, its influence neither diminishing nor vanishing but simply assuming new forms as old customs met new materials and opportunities. This persistent shaping of family life in the towns formed yet another strand in the broader experience of medieval cold, linking the intimate world of the hearth to the larger currents of commerce and climate that we have traced through village, manor, and marketplace. The same practical knowledge passed from parent to child in urban chambers echoed the lessons learned by shepherds on frost-covered hillsides or monks in stone cloisters, creating a shared cultural vocabulary of endurance that crossed every boundary of status and region. As we follow the story into the closing decades of the Middle Ages, however, new pressures from both the climate and the changing structures of daily work began to test these long-established adaptations in ways that would quietly prepare the ground for the transformations of the early modern era. We will turn next to the ways the cold influenced the rhythms of labor and leisure in these final medieval generations, where the familiar chill met the first stirrings of wider change in technology, belief, and the organization of time itself. The ways the cold influenced the rhythms of labor and leisure in these final medieval generations unfolded against a backdrop where incremental changes in technology and belief began to intersect with the long-standing realities of temperature, subtly altering how people allocated their time and energy without ever fully escaping the chill's quiet authority. In the countryside, the agricultural calendar that had long been dictated by frost and thaw grew more tightly constrained as the Little Ice Age deepened. Plowing and sowing in the raw early spring required bodies already wearied by months of indoor confinement, and workers moved with deliberate slowness to conserve warmth rather than speed. The scythes swing during harvest, once a rhythmic dance under milder skies, now often paused so that men could warm their hands at a small field brazier or stamp, feeling back into boots sodden with dew that refused to dry. Leisure, in turn, contracted inward. The long evenings that might once have included outdoor games or village dances were spent instead around the hearth, where storytelling and simple board games carved from bone or wood filled the hours between supper and sleep. The cold did not eliminate festivity but reshaped it. Christmas mumming plays or May Day observances were moved to covered spaces or shortened, their communal joy tempered by the practical need to keep moving or stay close to whatever heat could be mustered. In the workshops of towns and cities, the same pattern held with a distinctly urban inflection. Artisans whose trades demanded precision, goldsmiths, tailors, or scribes, found that cold-stiffened fingers slowed their craft and increased the risk of costly mistakes, prompting guild masters to schedule the most delicate work for the middle hours of the day when the sun, however weak, might add a few degrees through oiled parchment windows. The rhythm of labor adjusted accordingly. Apprentices rose earlier to stoke the fire before the master arrived, and the midday break lengthened slightly to allow hands to thaw properly over a shared pot of soup. Leisure here took the form of fireside companionship. After the day's labors, journeymen might linger in the workshop or gather in a guild hall warmed by a collective contribution of fuel, sharing ale and songs that celebrated saints associated with endurance or light in darkness. Belief itself offered a framework for enduring the chill. The liturgical year, with its emphasis on Advent's waiting and Christmas's promise of warmth in the manger, mirrored the seasonal struggle in ways that gave meaning to discomfort. Monastic chroniclers and parish priests alike wove the cold into sermons, reminding congregations that patience in the face of frost echoed the patience required for salvation, while the practical organization of time, marked by church bells that rang for matins or vespers regardless of temperature, imposed a steady cadence that helped bodies anticipate the next opportunity to warm themselves. Technological stirrings, modest yet significant, began to ease some of these constraints without transforming them entirely. The spread of chimneys into more middling homes allowed fires to burn cleaner and retain more heat in the living space rather than sending it uselessly up through a roof vent. Yet the cost of building or retrofitting one meant that many households still relied on the older open hearth well into the 15th century. Glass windows, once rare luxuries confined to cathedrals and palaces, appeared in greater numbers in prosperous urban dwellings, reducing drafts while still admitting what little winter light there was. Their installation required careful calculation, for a cracked pane could undo months of fuel budgeting in a single night. In some northern regions, the gradual adoption of sea coal, brought by coastal traders from newly exploited English seams, offered a hotter, more sustained burn than wood or peat, though its smoke was harsher and its transport added to the merchant's ledger. These changes met the cold on its own terms. They did not promise constant warmth, but rather a slightly more efficient negotiation with it, allowing families to stretch their stores further and perhaps carve out a few extra hours of comfortable labor or quiet reflection before the embers needed tending once more. The organization of time itself felt the cold's hand most clearly in the interplay between natural seasons and human schedules. The canonical hours that governed monastic and parish life continued without pause, yet the practical reality of traveling to church in darkness and ice encouraged shorter processions and more emphasis on indoor devotions. Village laborers, bound by manorial custom, found their work obligations adjusted informally when deep snow made roads impassable. Stewards recorded these delays in account rolls with the same matter-of-fact tone used for any other weather event, recognizing that forcing labor in conditions that risked frostbite served no one. Leisure, meanwhile, expanded around the fire in ways that fostered a richer oral culture. Long winter nights became occasions for recounting family histories, local legends, or moral tales drawn from the lives of saints who had braved northern winters themselves. Children absorbed these narratives while carding wool or mending tools, their young minds linking the physical act of staying warm with the cultural inheritance of resilience. Even the emerging practice of keeping household almanacs or noting saints' days on wall boards reflected a desire to anticipate the cold's peaks and troughs, turning the calendar into a quiet ally in the yearly campaign against discomfort. What strikes the modern listener in these late medieval patterns is how thoroughly the cold had become not an interruption but an organizing principle for both work and rest. Labor slowed and intensified in seasonal waves, while leisure grew more introspective and communal, centered on whatever heat could be sustained. Belief provided language and ritual to frame the experience, and technology offered incremental tools to manage it. Yet none of these shifts erased the underlying sensation of never quite being warm enough. The result was a society that had internalized the chill as a constant companion, one that shaped decisions large and small, from the timing of a guild meeting to the placement of a child's pallet, without ever quite naming it as the dominant force it was. This quiet integration of temperature into the fabric of daily existence prepared the ground, in subtle ways, for the changes that would accelerate as the medieval era gave way to the early modern, when new ideas about comfort, science, and the body would begin to question long-accepted limits. As the 15th century drew toward its close and the first hints of Renaissance thought and exploration stirred in the Italian cities and northern courts, these rhythms of labor and leisure continued to evolve under the same cold sky. Merchants planning voyages to newly charted lands calculated not only trade winds but the risk of winter delays in home ports, while scholars in unheeded scriptoria copied texts that spoke of classical ideals of balance and moderation, ideals that must have seemed distant indeed when their own breath clouded the page. The cold, ever practical, imposed its own commentary on these emerging ideas, reminding everyone that the body's needs remained rooted in the immediate demands of frost and fuel. In the countryside, the same seasonal cycle persisted with only slight modifications. In the towns, the workshops hummed with the same careful tending of fires, and in the great houses, stewards still tallied wood and peat against the lengthening nights. This interplay between enduring cold and the first whispers of broader transformation thus marked a transitional phase, one in which the medieval world's hard-won adaptations met the promise and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The familiar strategies of hearth and habit would carry forward, tested by new climates of thought as much as by the weather itself, and the quiet negotiation with temperature would continue to shape lives in ways both intimate and far-reaching. We will follow those threads next into the closing years of the era, where the cold's influence extended into the realms of medicine, household economy, and the slow shifts in social expectation that would eventually redefine what comfort itself meant in the centuries to come. Those threads into the closing years of the era carried the cold's influence steadily into the realms of medicine, household economy, and the slow shifts in social expectation, where the accumulated wisdom of centuries met. The first tentative questions about whether comfort could ever be more than a fleeting victory over the elements. In the medical understanding of the late 15th century, the cold was not merely an external discomfort but an internal imbalance to be managed with the same care given to diet and regimen. Physicians trained in the Galenic tradition viewed the body as governed by four humors, and an excess of cold and phlegm, exacerbated by the damp northern climate, explained the prevalence of rheumatic pains, persistent catarrhs, and the swollen joints that afflicted so many after a lifetime of never quite warming through. Treatments were practical and hearth-centered. Herbal decoctions of ginger, cinnamon, or sage simmered over the fire and taken warm to drive out the chill from within, while patients suffering from chilblains or frozen limbs were advised to rub the affected areas with oils warmed gently beside the embers rather than directly over flame. Midwives and village healers, often women whose knowledge passed through oral tradition, recommended keeping newborns and the elderly closest to the hearth during the worst weeks, swaddling them in wool that had been aired and warmed on a stool by the fire. The cold, in this medical worldview, was both cause and consequence. It slowed the circulation of blood and spirits, making the body sluggish, and therefore required constant vigilance through small, repeated acts of counterwarmth that blended learned theory with the everyday pragmatism of the household. Household economy reflected this same measured response, turning the management of fuel and fabric into a daily calculus that determined not only survival but the subtle gradations of status within the home. By the 1480s and 1490s, account books from prosperous urban merchants and lesser gentry show an increasing attention to the cost of sea coal versus firewood, with families budgeting for deliveries that arrived by river barge and were stored in backyard sheds to keep them dry. A single winter's supply might consume a noticeable portion of annual income, prompting wives to calculate precisely how many hours a bundle would last if the fire were banked at dusk and revived only for morning porridge. Clothing, too, became a more deliberate investment. Second-hand markets thrived in town squares where a patched but serviceable fur-lined cloak could be bartered against a length of wool, and tailors offered to reline old garments with cheaper rabbit or cat fur when miniver or squirrel lay beyond reach. Children's garments were handed down with care. Each patch and lengthening seem a record of the family's ongoing negotiation with the chill. The hearth itself evolved in small ways. Iron firedogs and andirons allowed logs to be stacked for better airflow, and the newer enclosed grates that appeared in some middling homes captured more heat while reducing the risk of sparks that could ignite the rushes. Yet these improvements were incremental. Most households still relied on the open fire or a single chimney, and the evening ritual of raking embers and covering them with ash remained as familiar as the tolling of the parish bell. Social expectations around comfort began to shift almost imperceptibly in these decades, influenced by the growing circulation of ideas from Southern Europe and the slow spread of printed texts that described warmer climes and classical ideals of balanced living. A noble household in the Loire Valley or the English Midlands might now speak of convenience in the arrangement of chambers, placing the solar closer to the kitchen so that warmed air could drift upward, or installing window seats padded with cushions to create small pockets of stillness away from the drafts. Yet these refinements were still framed within the accepted reality that true warmth was a luxury reserved for the few. Even a duke's retainers knew that their lord's greater hearth simply meant a larger circle of tolerable temperature rather than an absence of cold. In the towns, guild ordinances occasionally mandated that workshops maintain a minimum fire during winter hours, not out of sentiment but because frozen hands produced shoddy goods that damaged the collective reputation. The poor, meanwhile, relied on parish alms or the charity of religious houses, where bread and a night's shelter beside a communal brazier represented the outer limit of what society felt obliged to provide. The cold thus highlighted the quiet boundaries of obligation and expectation. It was everyone's companion, yet the resources to mitigate it marked the visible lines between ranks, even as those lines began to blur with the rise of a more commercial middling sort who could afford a second blanket or an extra sack of coal. These late medieval adjustments were never presented as a march toward modern comfort. They remained rooted in the same patient endurance that had sustained generations before. Physicians might recommend a posset of hot milk and ale before bed, but the milk itself had to be carried from the byre through the frosty yard. Householders might line their shutters with felt or old cloth, yet the wind still found its way through the gaps. Children learned their catechism or their trade by firelight, their lessons punctuated by the need to turn toward the flames and rub life back into chilled limbs. The era's chroniclers, writing in unheated scriptoria or manor chambers, recorded the weather with a resigned precision. Long winters, late springs, early frosts, treating the cold as a fact of divine order rather than a problem awaiting solution. This acceptance, however, did not preclude quiet innovation. The same period saw the first widespread use of brick chimneys in English towns and the increased importation of Baltic firs that allowed even modest households to add a layer of insulation without bankrupting the family purse. The cold remained constant, but the strategies for meeting it had grown more varied, more calculated, and more integrated into the emerging patterns of daily commerce and piety. As the 15th century drew to its close and the first voyages of exploration began to bring news of distant lands where winters were milder or resources more abundant, these domestic and medical practices continued to evolve in subtle conversation with the changing world beyond Europe's shores. Merchants returning from the Mediterranean spoke of warmer stone houses and olive wood fires, while printed broadsides carried descriptions of southern diets that promised to balance the northern humors. Yet for most people the immediate reality stayed anchored in the familiar round of fuel gathering, hearth tending, and the small comforts that could be coaxed from a world still governed by frost. The quiet transmission of knowledge, from healer to patient, mother to daughter, master to apprentice, ensured that the lessons of the cold would not be forgotten even as new ideas stirred. This extension of the cold's reach into medicine and household routine thus formed a bridge between the medieval world's hard-won adaptations and the early stirrings of a different sensibility, one that would eventually question whether perpetual chill was an inevitable condition of life. The familiar strategies persisted, tested now by wider horizons of trade and thought, while the body's daily negotiation with temperature continued to shape decisions both intimate and collective. We will follow those threads next into the very end of the medieval period and the first decades of transition, where the cold's influence began to intersect with emerging notions of privacy, health, and the slow redefinition of what a home and a life could reasonably demand in the face of the elements. The cold's influence began to intersect with emerging notions of privacy, health, and the slow redefinition of what a home and a life could reasonably demand in the face of the elements. In the closing decades of the 15th century and the opening years of the 16th, the gradual spread of printed books and the exchange of ideas across Europe introduced new ways of thinking about the body and the spaces it inhabited, yet these ideas met the stubborn reality of cold in ways that often complicated rather than simplified daily life. The concept of privacy, once largely foreign to the communal living of earlier centuries, began to take root in the homes of the prosperous merchant and gentry classes. Houses were subdivided into more chambers, parlors, closets, and separate bedrooms, allowing family members to withdraw from the shared hall or solar, yet each new room required its own source of heat if it was to be habitable during the long winter months. A merchant in Antwerp or a gentleman in the English shires might now enjoy the luxury of reading or writing in a private study lined with paneling to blunt drafts. But the fire in that smaller space burned less efficiently than the central hearth, demanding more frequent tending and greater fuel expenditure. Servants and apprentices, still sleeping in the older, open areas, felt the contrast more sharply, their nights spent in spaces that grew noticeably colder once the main fire was banked. The very desire for privacy thus created a new layer of calculation. Warmth had to be distributed rather than concentrated, and the household's total fuel budget stretched thinner across more isolated pockets of comfort. Health practices, too, evolved under the twin pressures of printed medical knowledge and the unrelenting climate. The dissemination of vernacular translations of Galenic and Hippocratic texts, along with the first printed herbals and regimen guides, encouraged householders to view cold not only as an environmental fact but as a humoral threat that could be countered through deliberate routines. A well-to-do family might consult a small printed volume recommending warm possets of ale and spices taken before retiring, or the application of warmed oils to joints stiffened by years of damp exposure. Midwives and apothecaries in town shops dispensed advice that blended ancient authority with local observation, suggesting that pregnant women keep their feet elevated near the fire to prevent the cold humors from settling in the lower body, or that children be given extra layers of linen under their woolens to trap body heat during the critical growing years. Yet these recommendations existed alongside the practical limits of the hearth. A decoction might be prepared with care, but if the fire had to be shared with cooking or drying clothes, the liquid cooled too quickly to deliver its promised benefit. Physicians themselves, attending patients in unheated chambers, noted in their casebooks how the Little Ice Age's harsher winters seemed to exacerbate fevers and fluxes, prompting them to prescribe more aggressive countermeasures such as heated bricks wrapped in cloth and placed at the foot of the bed. The cold, in this transitional medical worldview, was no longer accepted with pure resignation but was increasingly framed as something that could be managed through knowledge, even if the management itself required constant vigilance and resources that many could not command. The slow redefinition of home and life unfolded most visibly in the architectural and domestic choices of the rising middling sort. Timber-framed houses in growing towns began to incorporate more glass in upper windows and brick chimneys that allowed smoke to be drawn away cleanly. Yet these innovations spread unevenly and carried their own hidden costs. A family that invested in a second chimney for a private chamber might discover that the improved draft pulled heat upward too rapidly, leaving the ground floor cooler than before unless additional fuel was burned. Beds, once simple pallets drawn near the main fire, evolved into enclosed wooden frames with heavy curtains that could be drawn tight to create a miniature room within the room, trapping the warmth of shared bodies through the night. This innovation offered a quiet revolution in comfort for those who could afford it, yet it also marked a subtle shift in expectation. The idea that sleep could be more restorative, more private, and less interrupted by the need to rise and tend embers. Children raised in such households absorbed a slightly different lesson about the cold. Not that it was inevitable, but that it could be negotiated with greater ingenuity than their grandparents had known. Leisure, too, reflected this redefinition. The long winter evenings that had once been spent in communal storytelling now sometimes included quiet reading by candlelight in a curtained bed or beside a smaller, more efficient fire, with printed books of hours or moral tales providing a new kind of inner warmth that complemented the physical one. Even among the nobility and the higher clergy, these transitional pressures prompted adjustments that blended tradition with innovation. A great hall might still host feasts and assemblies, its tapestries and carved screens now supplemented by movable screens or portable braziers to create warmer zones within the larger space. Ladies in their withdrawing rooms experimented with footstools lined with fur and small charcoal stoves imported from the Low Countries, while gentlemen in their studies kept accounts or correspondence with hands warmed by gloves that could be slipped off when the quill was needed. Monasteries and collegiate foundations, facing the same climatic trends, began to retrofit dormitories with better glazing and occasional wall fireplaces, though the rules still emphasized endurance as a spiritual discipline. The cold's influence here intersected with emerging ideas of reform and personal devotion. A monk copying texts in a scriptorium might reflect on the contrast between the physical chill and the inner fire of faith, while printed pamphlets circulating among the laity encouraged household prayers that framed daily discomfort as a path to greater piety. Yet the practical reality remained. Fuel stores had to be guarded, clothing layered, and bodies kept in motion if the new sensibility of comfort was to have any substance at all. What emerges in these closing medieval decades is a quiet tension between inherited acceptance and the first glimmers of expectation that life might one day be less cold. The body's daily negotiation with temperature continued to shape decisions both intimate and collective, from the placement of a new chamber pot near the hearth to the timing of a merchant's winter voyage calculated against the risk of frozen harbors. Social expectations around health and privacy began to carry a subtle promise that with knowledge, trade, and careful husbandry, the chill might be pushed back a little further. Yet for the vast majority this promise remained aspirational. The familiar strategies of fuel gathering, hearth tending, and communal endurance persisted, tested now by wider horizons of printed learning and commercial opportunity, while the cold itself refused to yield its place as the quiet architect of daily rhythm. As the 16th century opened and the first stirrings of religious reform and expanded global trade began to reshape European society, these domestic and medical threads wove themselves more tightly into the broader fabric of change. Households in both town and countryside continued their seasonal calculations with the same pragmatic intelligence. Yet the language in which they described their efforts was shifting, influenced by new texts and new contacts with distant climates. The cold's reach extended into the organization of labor in the workshops and fields, where the old rhythms met the demands of an increasingly connected economy, and into the expectations of comfort that would gradually alter the very definition of a well-ordered life. We will turn next to those early 16th century intersections, where the medieval inheritance of endurance encountered the first systematic attempts to quantify, mitigate, and perhaps one day transcend the constant presence of chill in the northern world. Those early 16th century intersections unfolded as the medieval inheritance of endurance met the first systematic attempts to quantify, mitigate, and perhaps one day transcend the constant presence of chill in the northern world. Yet the cold itself remained a stubborn companion that refused to yield entirely to new ideas or new technologies. In the courts and universities of England, France, and the German lands, humanist scholars pored over printed editions of Vitruvius and other classical authors who described ideal Roman houses with hypocaust heating and south-facing windows, prompting architects and patrons to experiment with designs that captured more sunlight and retained heat more efficiently. Palaces and grand townhouses began to incorporate longer ranges of chimneys and glazed galleries where ladies and gentlemen could walk in relative comfort during the short winter days. Yet these innovations were expensive and slow to spread beyond the wealthiest circles. A merchant banker in Augsburg or a royal official in London might now consult a printed regimen of health that advised measuring the temperature of rooms with a simple hand test or noting the behavior of a candle flame to gauge drafts, turning what had once been instinctive habit into a more deliberate practice. Still, the practical reality for most families stayed anchored in the familiar hearth. The new learning offered language and aspiration, but the fuel cart still arrived on the same muddy streets, and the same damp wind slipped under doors that had not yet been fitted with the heavier seals some treatises recommended. The Reformation added its own layer of complexity to these negotiations with cold. As monastic houses were dissolved or reformed in the 1530s and 1540s, their carefully tended kale factories and shared warming rooms disappeared from the daily landscape of many towns and villages, leaving former monks and nuns to carry their habits of disciplined endurance into secular life or into the households of patrons who absorbed them as tutors or chaplains. Parish churches, stripped of some of their earlier ornaments, relied on the body heat of congregations clustered in box pews that were sometimes lined with straw or provided with small foot warmers filled with coals brought from home. Sermons in the new vernacular style spoke of spiritual warmth as a counter to physical chill, framing the endurance of winter as a test of faith that echoed the trials of the early Christian martyrs in northern climates. Yet the practical effects were mixed. The loss of monastic charity in some regions meant fewer communal shelters for the poorest during the hardest months, while the redistribution of former abbey lands sometimes placed better-managed fuel resources in the hands of gentry families who could afford to experiment with coal-burning grates. The cold, once regulated by the steady rhythm of the monastic bell, now became more visibly a matter of individual and household responsibility, even as printed prayer books encouraged families to gather around the hearth for evening readings that blended devotion with the quiet business of staying warm. Exploration and the first trickle of goods from distant continents introduced new materials that promised modest relief without transforming the underlying conditions. Furs from the Baltic and, increasingly, from the early North American trade routes reached northern ports in greater volume, allowing middling households to line hoods and cloaks with beaver or fox that held heat better than the rabbit or sheepskin of earlier generations. Spices such as ginger and pepper, once rare luxuries, appeared more regularly in printed recipe books and apothecary lists, where they were recommended as internal countermeasures to the cold humors that physicians still blamed for winter ailments. Shipmasters returning from voyages described warmer southern harbors and the ease with which Iberian houses trapped Mediterranean sun, prompting some northern builders to angle new windows more deliberately toward the south or to experiment with conservatories attached to kitchens where herbs could be grown year-round under glass. These imports and ideas circulated through the same merchant networks we glimpsed earlier, yet their benefits reached only those who could afford the additional cost. A bale of imported wool or a sack of exotic fuel additive remained a calculated luxury, weighed against the price of bread or rent when the winter stretched longer than expected. In the countryside, the seasonal rhythms continued with only slight modifications born of the new sensibility. Farmers who had absorbed printed almanacs noted the dates of expected frosts with greater precision and adjusted their planting schedules accordingly. Yet the plowman still walked behind his team with hands tucked into sleeves and the same damp earth clinging to his clogs. Village midwives, now sometimes guided by small printed midwifery manuals, advised keeping birthing rooms warmer with extra braziers, but the fuel for those braziers still came from the same coppiced woodlands or peat bogs that had served their grandmothers. Children learned their letters beside the fire from hornbooks or early primers that included moral verses about industry and thrift, the physical act of turning pages warmed by the glow reinforcing the lesson that comfort was something earned through foresight rather than granted by fortune. The cold, in these transitional years, began to be discussed in letters and household accounts with a tone that mixed resignation with a faint undercurrent of calculation. How many loads of coal would see the household through until spring, or whether a new set of glazed windows might repay their cost in saved fuel over a decade. What becomes clear in this early 16th century moment is a subtle but profound shift in the emotional texture of endurance. The medieval acceptance of cold as an unchanging fact of northern existence was gradually overlaid with the humanist and reformist idea that human ingenuity, guided by knowledge and faith, could push back the boundaries of discomfort. Yet this new expectation did not diminish the daily reality. It simply added a layer of quiet striving. A prosperous yeoman might install a second chimney in his hall and feel the difference in the evenings, yet his laborers in the byre still shared their warmth with the cattle on the coldest nights. A merchant's wife might read a regimen recommending warm spiced wine before bed and prepare it with care, yet the wine itself had to be fetched from a cellar that felt like ice until the fire had been blazing for an hour. The cold remained the silent partner in every calculation, shaping decisions about marriage portions, apprenticeships, and the timing of market journeys with the same quiet authority it had always held. As the middle decades of the 16th century approached and the religious and political upheavals of the Reformation deepened, these intersections between inherited practice and new aspiration grew more intricate. Households across the social spectrum continued their seasonal negotiations, yet the language in which they described those negotiations was changing, influenced by printed advice, changing patterns of land ownership, and the slow arrival of goods from further afield. The cold's influence extended into the emerging structures of early modern governance and commerce, where the management of fuel and warmth became matters of royal proclamation and civic ordinance as readily as they had once been matters of manorial custom. We will turn next to those mid-16th century developments, where the medieval inheritance of patient endurance encountered the first organized efforts by states and cities to regulate the resources that kept their populations from freezing, revealing how the constant chill began to shape not only private hearths but the public order of the age itself. Those mid-16th century developments saw the medieval inheritance of patient endurance encounter the first organized efforts by states and cities to regulate the resources that kept their populations from freezing, revealing how the constant chill began to shape not only private hearths but the public order of the age itself. In England under the Tudors, royal proclamations issued from the court at Whitehall or Greenwich began to address the mounting pressure on woodlands and peat bogs, restricting the export of timber and ordering local justices to survey fuel supplies before winter set in. Cities such as London and Paris responded with ordinances that fixed prices on sea coal and firewood, established licensed vendors, and in some cases created civic stockpiles to be distributed to the poor when frost locked the rivers or snow blocked the roads. These measures were born of necessity rather than benevolence. Harvest failures and the deepening Little Ice Age had driven up the cost of every cartload of fuel, and magistrates feared that unchecked scarcity would spark unrest among the laboring classes whose bodies already carried the accumulated wear of decades spent never quite warm. A mayor's account from mid-century Antwerp, for instance, records the careful allocation of peat bricks to parish wards, each bundle weighed and stamped so that no household received more than its allotted share, turning what had once been a private calculation into a matter of civic record. The lived texture of these regulations reached deep into daily existence. In the narrow lanes of a provincial English town, a widow or day laborer might queue at the guild hall on a designated morning, clutching a wooden token issued by the parish overseer, only to carry home a meager sack of coal whose heat would barely reach the corners of a single room. The same cold that had once been met with quiet family ingenuity now carried the added weight of official scrutiny. Householders learned to bank their fires earlier and rise later to stretch the supply, while children were sent to gather fallen branches under the watchful eye of foresters enforcing new enclosure rules. In the countryside, the story was similar but more dispersed. Manorial stewards, acting on royal instructions, limited tenants' rights to common wood, forcing families to rely on dry dung or carefully rationed peat that burned with a slower, smokier flame. The irony was quietly evident even at the time. Regulations intended to prevent suffering sometimes intensified the very discomfort they sought to ease, as fuel moved through bureaucratic channels that delayed delivery until the worst frosts had already arrived. Yet these efforts also created small pockets of shared relief. Civic bakehouses kept their ovens stoked longer into the evening so that citizens could warm a pot of pottage or simply stand in the radiant glow for a few stolen minutes, their bodies pressed close in a line that mixed all ranks in the common pursuit of heat. Public spaces themselves began to reflect this new attention to collective warmth. Town councils in the Low Countries and northern Germany ordered the construction of covered market halls with central braziers, where merchants and customers could conduct business without the wind cutting through their cloaks. Churches, now stripped of some medieval finery but equipped with box pews and occasional charcoal stoves, became unofficial warming stations during services that stretched through the coldest months. Congregants arrived with foot warmers wrapped in cloth, passing them discreetly from one family to the next while the sermon on endurance and providence unfolded above. Hospitals and almshouses, often funded by merchant guilds or reformed religious foundations, maintained larger fires in their wards, though the beds remained simple straw pallets and the windows still rattled in their frames. The cold, once a private affliction borne with stoic acceptance, had become a public concern that linked the health of the individual body to the stability of the realm. Physicians attached to royal or civic households began to note in their journals how prolonged exposure to damp chill contributed to the outbreaks of ague and catarrh that slowed trade and weakened armies, prompting early experiments with communal bathhouses heated by coal rather than wood. For the nobility and the growing administrative class, these regulations brought their own subtle shifts. A gentleman serving on the Commission of the Peace might spend winter mornings in a paneled chamber reviewing fuel petitions, his own hearth blazing with sea coal imported at crown expense, while outside his servants stamped their feet and blew on their fingers. The contrast highlighted the quiet gradations of comfort that the new order both acknowledged and reinforced. Those with means could supplement civic allowances with private purchases, while the laboring poor depended on the token system that sometimes ran short when the Thames or the Seine froze solid. Children of middling households learned a new vocabulary of thrift alongside their catechism, terms like allowance, ration, and stockpile, that framed the cold as a manageable resource rather than an immutable fate. Yet the body's memory of chill remained unchanged. Even the best regulated fire still left fingers numb by mid-afternoon and required the same ritual of layering wool and drawing curtains tight against the night air. As the century progressed and the religious wars and dynastic conflicts of the later 1500s tested these early systems of regulation, the cold's influence extended further into the machinery of state. Armies on campaign in the Low Countries or along the Scottish border carried portable braziers and issued extra rations of salt pork and ale precisely because commanders understood that a frozen soldier was a useless one. Naval crews on the North Sea routes learned to chip ice from rigging and to huddle in the galley around the cook's fire. Their endurance now factored into royal budgets alongside powder and shot. The same civic ordinances that governed fuel in peacetime were extended to wartime supply lines, revealing how thoroughly the chill had woven itself into the calculations of power. Households, meanwhile, continued their private adaptations, perhaps installing a second small grate in an upper chamber or experimenting with the first coal-burning stoves imported from the continent. Yet these innovations remained modest, always measured against the deeper reality that winter would come again, and that no proclamation could banish the damp that rose from earthen floors or the wind that slipped through every imperfect joint. The mid-16th century encounter between inherited endurance and organized regulation thus marked a quiet but significant evolution in the long story of northern cold, one in which the hearth remained central yet found itself increasingly connected to the broader currents of governance and commerce. The practical intelligence that had sustained families through centuries of frost now operated within a framework of public oversight, creating new tensions and new forms of resilience even as the climate itself showed no sign of relenting. As we follow the narrative into the later decades of the 16th century and the height of the Little Ice Age's grip, these regulatory efforts and domestic strategies would be tested by famines, enclosures, and the first stirrings of a more systematic interest in weather and its effects on human society, revealing how the constant presence of chill continued to shape not only the rhythms of daily life but the very structures that sought to contain it. The constant presence of chill continued to shape not only the rhythms of daily life but the very structures that sought to contain it. Yet as the 16th century unfolded and the Little Ice Age pressed its coldest decades upon northern Europe, those regulatory efforts and domestic strategies faced their sternest tests, revealing once more how thoroughly the medieval inheritance of endurance had prepared people for a world that still refused to offer easy warmth. The open hearths that had served generations in wattle and daub cottages, the carefully layered woolens handed down through families, the seasonal stockpiles of peat and kindling guarded with quiet calculation. These were not relics of a simpler time but living adaptations that continued to sustain households long after the Middle Ages had begun their slow transition into something recognizably early modern. The cold remained an unrelenting companion, shaping the layout of villages and the timing of royal progresses, the prayers offered in unheated churches and the ledgers kept in merchant counting houses, the shared pallets of apprentices and the curtained beds of the gentry. It had never been merely weather. It was a defining condition of existence that quietly ordered priorities from the humblest laborer to the highest lord. Across the centuries we have followed, that condition wove itself into every facet of medieval life with a persistence that modern central heating makes almost impossible to imagine. Rural families in their single-room dwellings learned to bank embers each night and rise before dawn to the same penetrating dampness that had followed them into sleep, their animals providing the only extra degrees of body heat in exchange for shared space and moisture. Urban artisans in timbered workshops rotated tasks to keep hands from stiffening, while guild ordinances and civic stockpiles turned what had once been private survival into a matter of public order. Nobles in stone halls and monastic communities in vaulted cloisters experienced parallel versions of the same discomfort. High ceilings that stole heat upward, flagstone floors that held the night's frost, and the constant awareness that even the grandest architecture could not banish the chill entirely. Clothing evolved as a second skin of defense. Linen next to the body, wool that retained warmth even when damp, furs reserved for the coldest months or the highest ranks. Yet feet stayed cold in straw-stuffed clogs and fingers numbed during long hours of labor. Health reflected the accumulated toll. Chilblains, persistent coughs, and rheumatic aches accepted as part of the turning year, treated with herbal infusions simmered over the same fire that cooked the evening pottage. Social bonds tightened around that fire. Stories, songs, and plans were shared in its limited circle of light, turning necessity into the foundation of community and quiet contentment. The seasonal cycle only deepened this intimacy with cold. Autumn brought the anxious gathering of fuel alongside the harvest. Winter contracted life inward to the hearth and the shared pallet. Spring arrived with mud that chilled feet anew, and summer nights still carried the memory of frost in the northern air. Ingenuity met limitation at every turn. Peat cut from bogs and dried on racks, chimneys slowly replacing smoke holes, glass appearing in wealthier windows, coal beginning its cautious entry into urban grates. Yet each advance was measured against the deeper reality that warmth was never guaranteed and never evenly distributed. The nobility might enjoy larger hearths and tapestries to blunt drafts, but servants in the halls knew the sharper bite of the same night air. Monasteries turned discomfort into discipline, while merchants factored frozen rivers and stiffened ropes into their contracts and profit margins. Even as printed books and humanist ideas introduced new ways of thinking about regimen and comfort, the body's daily negotiation with temperature remained rooted in the practical intelligence cultivated over centuries. Foresight in laying stores, thrift in tending flames, resilience in accepting small victories such as a fire that lasted until morning or a cloak that still held its lanolin. What it meant to be cold all the time in the Middle Ages, then, was far more than physical discomfort or seasonal hardship. It was a silent but powerful architect of an entire way of life, fostering a society whose rhythms were intimately tuned to the management of scarce warmth and whose people developed a profound, unspoken appreciation for the small, hard-won comforts that made existence bearable. The cold encouraged cooperation, neighbors sharing ovens or labor, families huddling together, communities pooling resources under civic or manorial custom, and it instilled habits of patience, calculation, and quiet endurance that crossed every boundary of rank and region. It shaped health and expectation, child-rearing and labor, faith and storytelling, turning the hearth into the literal and emotional center of existence. In doing so, it left an enduring legacy, a reminder that comfort has never been a given, but has always been something coaxed from the world through ingenuity, community, and a measured acceptance of natural limits. Even as the medieval era gave way to new technologies, new beliefs, and new horizons of trade, the fundamental sensation persisted for the great majority, a thread of continuity that bound the 15th century peasant to the Elizabethan townsman and beyond. Today, listening in the quiet of an evening with warmth that arrives at the turn of a dial, we may find ourselves reflecting on how profoundly different that world was from our own. The flickering hearth, the visible breath in the morning air, the careful rationing of fuel that stretched through months of frost. These were not inconveniences to be solved but realities to be lived with, shaping human experience in ways both constraining and strangely enriching. They remind us that the texture of daily life is often written in the small, material details we rarely notice until they are absent. The weight of layered wool, the scent of wood smoke on clothing, the shared silence around a dying fire. The medieval world's long struggle with cold was neither romantic nor merely miserable. It was simply human, grounded in the practical necessities and quiet resiliences that allowed societies to endure and, in their own way, to flourish. One wonders what detail of that long struggle against the medieval cold lingers most with you tonight. Perhaps the patient tending of embers through the night, the closeness of families around a single hearth, or the way a seemingly minor innovation like a better chimney could transform the feel of an entire winter, or which aspect of that world you find hardest to imagine enduring in your own daily life. If these calm, thoughtful journeys into the lived realities of the past have offered you something valuable for your evenings of reflection or rest. I hope the episodes to come will continue to find their way to you. Until then, thank you for listening.